Yes, it has. Reminder for me to turn my phone off. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome. Great to see all of you here this morning. Glad that you've joined us for our Bible class today. Invite you to be opened up to our text. We're going to be in Zechariah chapter 7 today. If you haven't been with us, or if you've slept since then, let me give you a real quick recap of what it is that we're covering in here. We're walking our way through several conversations that occur in the Old Testament, some of the lesser-known books of the Bible, and some of the lesser-known conversations, God and His people, mostly through the prophets. And we find ourselves today in a conversation that takes place between God and His people in Zechariah chapter 7. So I'll give you a moment to be opening up to that. This week I had a series of back and forth text conversations with Roger, who brought up some very, very interesting things from last week's conversation in class together, specifically about Zechariah, his background, who he is, his lineage, some insights on that. And so I was compiling, looking at all the different texts back and forth and the information he was sending me. And it occurred to me that rather than me trying to take all this stuff that he had researched and regurgitate it back to you, I asked him if he would just take 3 minutes this morning and share some of that research with you, because I found it to be very interesting and helpful. And so I'm going to pass the class here to Roger for a moment. Are you? Well, if you wouldn't mind, the people who watch online have told me that if we don't have something for the mic, that it doesn't pick up. Did you set the timer?
Yeah, he gave me the microphone.
He's got the microphone. Kylie's got the timer.
And Dad always said that, he grabbed the microphone, so yeah, 3 minutes. Yeah, we'll see. First, I want to say we've been studying a message in Zechariah. When I do my study, I like to look at the person who is Zechariah and set the stage from his life and the surrounding time frame. And that's where I picked up my study that Jeff is referring to. And one of the things that you keep seeing in the Bible that's being repeated throughout the whole Bible is genealogies. You say, well, like right in this one, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce the name, except I do. You say that when you're married. I do. So it calls Zechariah the son of Berechiah. Would that be close? Anyhow, he calls him the son of Berechiah. So that's where I started my study, my research, was to see what that was about. Because there's, as far as we know, there's only one I do in the Bible, and it's this guy right here. Well, I do was not, I'm going to surprise you, I do was not Zechariah's grandfather. Wow. That's because what we read here looks like it's his grandfather. There is about 7 or 8 generations between Zechariah and I do. So why do they say, talk about his dad and then go all the way to I do? That concerned me to some extent as to why that was happening. So I started reading about it, and what you run into is that throughout the whole Bible, you kind of get this kind of skipping generations, like Jesus, the son of David. We've got a lot of generations in between there that David's not his grandfather or his father or his. It just doesn't work that way. So what I decided to do was to try to see how I do works into this. And what I found out, which was interesting, is I do was the prophet at the time of Solomon. And he was presenting some concerns and some principles about the first temple, not the second one. And I got his messages in dreams and visions, just like Zechariah did. So, and Zechariah is talking about the second temple. But there's a lot of corresponding and almost the same type of thing from that you get from Zechariah. I'm going to run over 3 minutes. That's all there is to it. Anyhow, they were talking about the same thing. So one of the things in class that I'd ask, I don't know if we really got an answer or whatever. If they did, I forgot it. How do the people know that the person is a prophet? And you take a look at Zechariah, he's from a family of prophets. That's number one. And the people at the time of Zechariah, because Solomon's time frame was so high up in the Jewish respect at the time of Solomon, everybody looked for the time of Solomon because it was great for the Jews. But they knew that Zechariah was in that line. But the other thing was, there's your spiritual connection. The other thing was, Zechariah was part of this exiled group. So these people could see that he was also a member of them, okay? So they had the physical contact and they had the spiritual contact in all this. And to me, the people saw that, and to me, a certain extent, answers the question, is how did the people know who a prophet was? So it kind of answers, you can go back to the Bible and answer anything, I believe. That kind of answered part, or at least a big part to me of what the question was. And I think I wasn't too far off at 3 minutes, but
perfect. Thank you very much.
No, I appreciate it.
You can see why I decided to let him explain that, because he can do so much better than I could, and I think it was really very fascinating information and very helpful information. I have to say that for how many times, you know the old expression, I was this many years old when I actually stopped to think, I just assumed it was his grandfather. I just always took that to be the case. And so what an interesting insight there, and I appreciate very much your research and your willingness to share that with us. That is really helpful. Zechariah chapter 7, a conversation that we're going to be looking at today. Today we're going to be looking at worship as ritual or as an extension of one's true heart. And I think this is a very timely message, because today, as we are stepping into our worship service here in just a few moments, we have this very same kind of challenge before us. We are going to experience some very, very normal, ordinary, well-practiced, well-rehearsed traditions, rituals. We're going to read the Word of God together. We're going to sing songs together. We're going to experience communion together. We're going to hear a message heard. And these are all things that can become very ordinary and very devoid of the heart if we're not careful. And one of the things that we're seeing in the book of Zechariah is that timeless message that we have to be really careful that the things we do with regularity don't become so ordinary that they lose their heart. It's important that we remember that, first and foremost, when we come together for a time of worship, it's a matter of heart, not a matter of ritual. It's not an empty practice. It's not something that we sit in the same pew and we do the same things and we walk out and God's pleased because we checked the boxes and we did the things. God's pleased when our hearts are right. God's pleased when He looks into our souls and recognizes that this is a true expression of our gratitude, our thankfulness, our praise, our worship to Him. It is possible, I would suggest, to perform an act of worship and not really worship at all. And one of the questions we need to regularly ask ourselves is, I went to worship, I participated in worship, I sat in a worship service. Did I worship? Was this for me an act of worship? Did I contribute to this meaningfully as an act of worship? Was my heart in a worshipful setting, a worshipful sense? And we're going to see that what God is looking for is He's looking for worshipers that bring a true heart. He's looking for worshipers who bring their true spirit. He's looking for people who don't necessarily go through and check the boxes in the best looking way or the smoothest way or sing the songs with the prettiest voices. What He's looking for are the people whose heart are really right. A line that kept coming up as I was preparing this: motives and mercy over mere motions. Motives and mercy over mere motions. It's not about going through the motions. It's true when we talk about a worship service that we're looking for our motive. What is the heart truly behind this? But in our everyday life, and I'm not going to get into the controversial what is worship and what's not worship, but the reality is that we're called to extend worship outside these walls and outside this 1 hour. And our lives are to be an expression of our gratitude, an expression of our love to God, an expression of our praise and adoration of God. And that's going to come out in the way we treat other people, in the way we go about our lives, in the generosity we show, in the kinds of spirit that we demonstrate in the world. And that's where mercy comes in. Are you living a life that is exhibiting mercy in the world around you? Are you living a life that when you come into this place for the purpose of worship, that you can really examine your motives and see that they pass the true test? Because it's not about simply going through motions. It's really about checking your motives and living your life with mercy. So let's begin by looking at our passage of Scripture together today, Zechariah chapter 7, and we're going to be looking at the first 14 verses. In the 4th year of King Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month, which is Chislev. Now the people of Bethel had sent Shazar, something. And I don't know. And their men to plead for the Lord's favor by asking the priests who were at the house of the Lord of armies, as well as the prophets, should we mourn and fast in the 5th month, as we have done these many years? Then the word of the Lord of armies came to me: ask the people of the land and the priest, when you fasted and lamented in the 5th and in the 7th month for these 70 years, did you really fast for me? When you eat and drink, don't you eat and drink simply for yourselves? Aren't these the words that the Lord proclaimed through the earlier prophets when Jerusalem was inhabited and secure, along with the surrounding cities, and where the southern region and the Judean foothills were inhabited? The word of the Lord came to Zechariah. The Lord of armies says this: make fair decisions. Show faithful love and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless or the resident alien or the poor. Do not plot evil in your hearts against one another. But they refused to pay attention. And they turned a stubborn shoulder, and they closed their ears so they would not hear. They made their hearts like a rock so as not to obey the law or the words of the Lord that the Lord of armies had sent by his Spirit through the earlier prophets. Therefore intense anger came from the Lord of armies. Just as he had called, they would not listen. So when they called, I would not listen, says the Lord of armies. I scattered them with a windstorm all over the nations that had known them, and the land was left desolate behind them, and no one coming or going. And they turned a pleasant land into a desolation. Let's get a little bit of a context here. What he's talking about here, referring back to a previous time. And the people are coming to him with a question. This is the conversation part of our discussion. This whole series of lessons is based around conversations. And a lot of times what we have are the people coming to God and say, should we do this? What about this? What's the right way to do this? And God giving an answer. And the question they have is, all this time we've been in exile, for 70 years we've been in exile, and we've had a practice in that exile that the 5th and the 7th month we mourned and fasted. We mourned and fasted because we were away from the temple, we were away from our homeland, we were in exile, we were oppressed, and so we mourned and fasted every 5th and 7th month. They say, well, here we are, we're back. We're back now in our homeland. Should we continue that practice? And God does what God does. In fact, it's so interesting when you see the Old Testament and you see the way God interacts with his people is very, very similar to the way Jesus, when he came in his ministry, talked to people. I don't remember the exact number, but it's an astonishing percentage. It is said, people who have studied such things, that only like 3% of the time when Jesus was asked a direct question did he give a direct answer. It's very rare that someone would walk up and say, is this red or blue? And he would say blue. Very, very rare. The most common thing Jesus would do when someone asked him a question was to ask a question back. The most common response from Jesus to a question is another question. And that's exactly what we see happening here. They come to God and they say, for all these 70 years, we've been fasting and mourning for the 5th month and the 7th month. We're back. Should we continue to do that? He doesn't say yes or no. He says, well, let's go back and look at those 70 years. Let's go back and really examine what you think you were doing and what you were really doing for all those years. When you were really fasting, were you? When you were going without food, when you were mourning and lamenting, were you really worshiping, or were you going through the motions? In verses 4 through 6, then the word of the Lord of the armies came to me, ask all the people. Here's the question back. Ask all the people and the priest, when you fasted and lamented in the 5th and 7th month for these 70 years, did you really fast for me? When it comes to questions of worship, when it comes to questions of worship practice, when it comes to so many of the things that we get, rightly so, there is a very, very strong importance of making sure worship is done right. We do want to make sure that our worship practices are those that God has asked for and that those that are proper. But I think that an important question that we often don't ask is this act something our heart's really in the first place? Is this something that we're really doing for God? God says, yeah, you were hungry and sad 2 months of the year. Yeah, but did it really have anything to do with me? Was it really in the right place? Yeah. Before the next fast. Yeah. That's a good question, Roger, and because, you know, one of two things. Either they're really looking way into the future and wanting to really plan for this, or they have something else in mind here. And they're kind of thinking, you know, I really don't want to do this. And can we get out of this? Is this something that, you know, we can just do without now? And I think that in both of those questions, Roger, it comes back to the point that we're making in this, and that is motive. What was the motive behind this? I have to just say, this is my big opinion, and I haven't researched this, just my knee-jerk thought on this is, if they were planning it 5 months in advance out of a good heart, the rest of this conversation probably doesn't make a lot of sense. Because if they had such focus and worshipful anticipation of this upcoming fast, that they were already planning it, then that to me might reveal that their motive was good. And if their motive was good, then everything God is talking to them about is invalid. So I think God's probably looking at them and going, your motive's not right even in this question, let alone the whole practice. And I think that's a good point. The timetable there is an interesting one, Roger. I'm glad you brought that up. Motives. The motives of the people didn't match the intentions that God had. Jump down with me to verses 9 and 10. The Lord of armies says this, make fair decisions, show faithful love, compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow, the fatherless, the resident alien, the poor. Do not plot evil in your hearts against one another. You see, they came asking a question about fasting. God responded to them with a question about their actions. God responded with a question about, how do you treat each other? How do you live with people who have less than you? How do you live with one another in sense of community? And it's interesting when you stop to think that in some ways we look at this and say, God didn't answer their question. But in a very real way, I think God's saying, let me point you to the better question. The better question is not a matter of this particular ritual, which, by the way, you made up. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Let me be very clear here. We don't read in the Old Testament law that this 5th and 7th month was something God gave them necessarily as a law, a binding law for them to do. But they did, and I think that's a perfectly fine and acceptable thing to do. In the New Testament, we are told when you fast. We're not told the days, we're not told how often, we're not told the frequency. We're just simply told when you fast with an expectation that we will. So for us to say we are going to have a day of fasting on a certain day is a fine and proper thing to do. What's not fine and proper then is to place that equal to the commands of God and say, if you don't follow our prescribed day of fasting, then you aren't right with God, because we made that up, not him. So there's the first thing that we have to be careful of. When we do, even out of a good heart, step into an extra biblical ritual, that we don't press it on others as a way of determining if they're right with God. Second thing is, we have to be careful that the things we become accustomed to don't lose their value. For 70 years, they've done this. And over the course of those 70 years, it has ceased to be something important to them. The ritual that they are so outwardly displaying is not revealing an inward motivation that's right and proper. God is saying to them, you're going through this big show of a month-long fast and lamentation, and you're doing all this outward ritual. But the stuff I'm really interested in, you're not taking care of. You can do all the fasting you want. If you don't treat people nicely, you're not pleasing to God. I don't mean you, I mean people. We can go through all the ritual we want. We can sit in the pews and do the stuff and check the boxes and sing the songs, but if our hearts don't truly reflect an attitude that breaks our hearts to see the situation and plight that the poor are in, the situation and the plight of the immigrant, the situation and the plight of the widow, if we can't look with compassion upon the people around us and the situations that they're in, it really doesn't mean much to God, all the boxes we check and the hoops we jump through, especially not the ones of our own creation. And a second part to that, notice there in the end of verse 10, plotting evil in your hearts against one another. You see, it's not only how they were looking at those less fortunate, but it's how they were looking at one another. They weren't looking at one another with the kind of attitude and love and compassion that God wants them to. And then in verse 11, we see what happened. They refused to pay attention, turned a stubborn shoulder, closed their ears so they would not hear, and they made their hearts like a rock so as not to obey the law or the words that the Lord of armies had sent by his Spirit through the earlier prophets. I want to pause for a moment here and hear from you, and let's talk together. But I just wanted to set up the framework to be able to ask a couple of questions with you. One of them is, how do you see in a modern context this same situation of ritual and motive? How do you see that play out in our world today in a modern context? Jim? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that's an outstanding point, that we can, given our own, left to our own devices, we can very easily fall into a legalistic kind of Christian mentality. That I have these things to do, and if I do these things, then I'm right with God. It's all about checking the boxes. It's all about doing the stuff. Now, the danger of that, the appeal of that is, no one is denying those things are important. And here's where I think we find ourselves in a little bit of a predicament, because no one is saying those things aren't important. Those things are important. God told us to do these things. God said, this is what I want from you. And so we do need to do that. But then when we start attributing our ability to do it perfectly to our own salvation, now we've fallen into this situation where, frankly, not to be crass, but Jesus didn't need to die. If it's all about just us making sure we do all the stuff right, then we're good with God, then what was the whole point? The other side of the coin is also true. The shift to the far other side is that substance doesn't matter at all, that it is just an emotional thing. And so I think one of the ways that we see this play out in our world today is this wide chasm that we have between an emotional but substance-less belief and faith and a legalistic and heartless belief and faith. Roger. Yeah.
And I thought, well, the ones that were for it were near water where they could have it. The ones that were against it were in the middle of the United States.
Those churches in Alaska were really conservative, weren't they? I mean, they were conservative. Yeah. If it wasn't for those Florida churches, we all would have been that way. No. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an excellent way to look at there. An experience that shows how we see that. And that is when we connect our own personal pet issues to a particular practice, and then, you know, we're creating a hoop and saying, now you jump through it, and this is the way I'm going to determine if you're this kind of Christian or this kind of Christian, the kind I can fellowship with or not. Yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. The second half of that I'm not going to touch. You and Carlisle are going to work that out on your own. Honestly, jokes aside, I think you're absolutely right to look at the timeline of this. I think there's some real lesson in that. And I think that what you're talking about there is something that we can look at, if we'll really be honest, we can look at in terms of our own raising of the next generation, the rising generation. Because that first generation probably had true hearts of lament. They were torn from their homeland. This was their place. This was their country. This was not only political, sociological, ethnic, racial, but spiritually. This was the spiritual center of their universe, and they were pulled from it. I think that would result in lament. I think that would result in broken hearts. And I'm not here to judge that first generation. I'm here to listen to what the Scripture says about the following generations. But I think you're probably right. I think that first generation probably had a really good motive. We are torn from our homelands. Let's institute a fast to lament and to plead and to pray and to mourn about what has happened to us. But when we have generation after generation after generation of young people that are taught a ritual without indoctrinating the heart behind it, then they end up with empty ritual years later. And that's exactly where we can be in churches today if we're not careful. If we're raising kids to say, these are the things we do and don't do, and we're not teaching them why, we're not teaching them why it matters, we're not teaching them the heart behind it and the emotion. When we say, this is the time in our worship service when we give, but we don't tell them why, we don't talk about the heart of generosity and what that's supposed to mean. When we say, this is the time when we sing songs, but we don't talk to them about, have you ever stopped to think what you're really doing when you sing? Have you ever really stopped to think about what is happening in that moment? If we're not teaching our children what's going on in those moments, then we cannot be surprised years later when all it is to them is just, that's the thing we do, we check the box because that's all I ever knew it to be. Over time, even when the ritual might have started good, it can lose its motive. It can lose its heart underneath it if we're not constantly reiterating that. And we can sometimes, without meaning to, emphasize to our children the importance of the ritual and never take the time to teach them the motive behind it. CJ. Mm. Yeah. 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 Didn't we check all these boxes? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. I totally agree with you, CJ. I think there's so many nuggets of wisdom in that statement that I think is really worth us considering. You know, that phrase "examine your heart" I think is so critical. You're absolutely right. You know, if we give lavishly and our heart's not in it, God doesn't care. He's not interested in that. Now, he'll still use that generosity to do good things. But in terms of our heart in behind it, that's the thing that he's really looking for. I think about the times in the Old Testament when God would say things like, I wish you would just close the temple. I wish you would just stop. Just stop doing the stuff because you're so without a heart behind it that I would rather you not do the stuff than to do the stuff from the wrong heart. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. And boy, you're absolutely right in that passage. You know, on that final day, aren't we going to say to you, I did all these things? And God's going to say, you may have done all those things. I don't even know who you are. We never had a relationship. You and I aren't a thing. And what a tragic reality that can be. Yes, there, and then we'll come over here, and then we'll go back to Dale. Hmm. Yep. It's true. One generation away from apostasy should be something that causes us fear. That's apostasy in practice, true. Also apostasy of heart. Both of those things are necessary for us to keep in track. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. 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 Something that happened 70 years ago. Yeah. This generation, this country is all they've ever known. This exile is all they've ever known. They grew up. Yeah. Hmm. Yep. Yeah, or no hair. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I remember my dad. Every year the anniversary of JFK's assassination, would talk to us about that. I'm like, yeah. I mean, I remember from the history books, but then I remember talking to my older kids about the Challenger, and they're like, yeah, I read about it in history books. And now I'm talking to my younger kids about 9/11, and they're like, yeah, we know all about that. It's in the history books. You might have book knowledge of it, but those of us who live through it have emotional attachment to it. And if we're not transferring that emotional attachment, then it just becomes something we read about in the book. We just become something we read about. Joy Bingman sent me a text this week, and she said, "Are churches just book clubs that never changed books?" And even the Bible, with all of its truth, can become just book knowledge. And we have to be careful of that. I'm going here, and then I'm coming across here. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I think that's right, Dale. And by the way, if you do decide to do that, send me your chicken, catfish, and ham. I'm happy to take that off your hands. Both sides of that are true, and that's something that has to be remembered. When somebody has a more self-restrictive approach to something, that deserves to be respected. We don't need to make fun of that. That self-restricted person need not apply that to other people. But if that's something they choose to do, and I think that's a totally fine thing to do, it just becomes problematic when I make fun of them for it, or they look down on me because I don't. And I think those both have to be remembered. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Th- That 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 passion of the heart is something that has to be part of, um, the bringing up of that next generation. That's really critical. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. Yeah, and I think that's an important principle that that we see over and over in the New Testament. Paul would commonly, talk to these young proteges that he was pouring into, and he would say, "You need to go find other people. You need to go find other people that you can pour this message into, because that next generation needs those leaders. That next generation needs that lesson." So many times, what we do see is a family or a group or a church is led by a strong person, and then when that person's no longer there, there's nobody who's ready to step up and take the reins from that, and that becomes a real problem. We're out of time. Let me close by looking at the last part of this and drawing a quick application. Verse 13, "Just as he had called and they would not listen, so when they called, I would not listen, says the Lord of armies. I scattered them with a windstorm over all the nations that had not known them, and the land was left desolate behind them, and no one coming or going. They turned a pleasant land into a desolation." My friends, the reality is that if we're not careful, as Jen just said, to learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And the reality is that if we don't listen, that the windstorm hasn't ceased to blow. The God who is the God who said finally, okay, fine, have it your way, is still the God who will finally say, okay, fine, have it your way. And what we'll find ourselves in is the very same desolation. The other side of that is the good news. And that is that we have an opportunity to raise up a generation. That we have an opportunity to raise up a generation that not only understands the stuff, but understands why we do the stuff. And I think that one of the things we need to do first and foremost as we step into this very moment of worship in just a few moments is to really be honest with ourselves about what are we doing and what's the heart behind it. And then we need to ask ourselves the second question, which is how do I pass this on to the generation coming up so that they will have the heart behind it that God's looking for. You guys have been great today. Thank you so much.